You ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. So, all right. What else do I want to tell you about agreeableness? Well, I could tell you a little bit about the regulation of aggression. One of the things I studied, especially when I was in Montreal, was the development of antisocial behavior in children and in adolescence. And antisocial children, so they tend to be aggressive. Antisocial children tend to turn into antisocial. There's conduct disorder, technically speaking. Conduct disordered children tend to turn into conduct disordered adolescents, and then they tend to turn into antisocial and criminal adults. And so I can tell you a little bit about how that progresses, I think, because it's quite interesting, and it isn't what people generally think. So the first thing is, if you want to be criminal, the best way to do it is to be really low in agreeableness and really low in conscientiousness. Because low in agreeableness means things are for me and not for you, and you're not going to get me to do a damn thing that I don't want to do, and I'll stand my ground. And low in conscientiousness means you can do all the work, and I'll sit back and take the benefits. And so if you have someone who's really disagreeable and really unconscientious, you have someone who's starting to border on psychopath. And if you add high intelligence and high emotional stability to that, then you have someone who won't work but will reap the benefits, who doesn't give a damn about you, who's assertive as hell, and who's smart. And a person like that's also going to be charismatic, because extroverted, disagreeable people are kind of narcissistic, but they'll put themselves forward strongly, and if they don't show any signs of fear, that also indicates that they're confident, and it's easy for people to confuse that with competence. And that's how psychopaths get away with what they're doing, although they have to move from person to person because their reputation will track them. So anyways, back to the development of aggression in children, the development of criminality in adults. Here's how it seems to work, at least in part. It's more complicated than this, but I'll put in some of the sociological elements as well. So if you take children and you group them together in in groups defined by age, so let's say you have 32-year-olds, 33-year-olds, 34-year-olds, all the way up to 18. And then you watch them interact, and you code their behavior for kicking, biting, fighting, and property theft, then what you'll find is that the 2-year-olds are by far the most aggressive of the lot. So that's pretty interesting, you know, because you think, well, children are naturally peaceful, and if they're aggressive, it's because they learn it. It's like, no, that's true for a small minority of children. But there's a substantial number of children who are aggressive at 2 by nature. Most of them are male. Now that doesn't mean most children are like that, because they're not. Even if you look at 2-year-olds, who are the most aggressive human beings, most 2-year-olds aren't aggressive, but some of them are. And most of those are male. Okay, so then let's say you identify this cohort of aggressive 2-year-olds, and you track them across time. Track them for the next 2 to 4 years, or track them until they're 4 years old. What you find is the vast majority of the hyper-aggressive male 2-year-olds get socialized perfectly well. So by the time they're 4, they're temperamentally probably still more aggressive, but they've become civilized little monsters, so other people can tolerate them. And that means that they've had parents or peers or educational experiences that enabled them to learn how to interact productively with other kids and to bring their aggressive nature under control. Some of that seems to be mediated by the opportunity to engage in rough and tumble play. And that's one of the things that we know that helps socialize rats, for example. It's vital to them, but it also seems to really be good for socializing young kids. And rough and tumble play, which is something that adult males particularly like to do with young kids, by the way, not before 9 months because they're just too little, but once they become ambulatory and, you know, kind of puppy-like so that they're a little bit more robust, then you can play a lot with them, and you can play with them right at the edge of danger too, which kids absolutely go nuts for that. They love that. So when I had little kids, I made this kind of wrestling ring out of these 2 couches that we had that would hook together. And I'd bring them on there and, you know, toss them up in the air and catch them, you know, 8, 10 feet. no, a foot in the air and catch them, and they'd go like this, and then, I'd catch them and they'd laugh, and I'd throw them up and they're all freaked out, and then they'd laugh, and so they're learning trust with that in an embodied way, and they're also learning, and this is from stretching them out and wrestling them and twisting them around and letting them pull on your hair and hit you and all of those things. They learn deep in their bones exactly what can hurt them and what doesn't, and you want to kind of push them to the edge, so that they can tell the difference between what hurts and what's still within the realm of the game. And you do the same thing when they're wrestling with you, so they learn not to awkwardly stick their thumb in your eye or do things that are actually painful, like grab your lip and pull it. It's like, no, you let go of my lip, And so that seems to help regulate the aggressive impulses and help the child find a more appropriate embodiment. You could think that what you're doing in some sense when you're rough and tumble playing with kids is teaching them how to dance, because that is what you're doing. You're making them comfortable in their bodies in all of its extension, and building in that kind of body fluency that you see in people who are well situated inside themselves. And so that's something to really think about, and it's appalling. We know that the ability to engage in rough and tumble play among rats inhibits aggression, impulsive aggression among rats. We also know that if you deprive rats of the opportunity to engage in rough and tumble play, they show prefrontal cortical developmental deficits and manifest behaviors that are akin to attention deficit disorder, which you can then treat with Ritalin. And so one of the things that's happening with boys, because they're way more dosed with attention deficit disorder medication than girls, is that their natural proclivity to engage in robust and troublesome active play isn't appropriate for a school environment where you're just supposed to sit down and shut up, and so the kids get hyperactive. And instead of letting them out to run around until they fall over half exhausted, which is exactly what you should do, you medicate them so that their exploratory systems, which are the activity of which is facilitated by the dopaminergic agonist, that's the ADHD medication, suppresses the play function. It's absolutely appalling. There's no excuse for it. But it's a good indictment of the education system, because why in the world would you take 6-year-old kids and get them to sit without moving for 5 hours? Unless you want them to grow up fat and stupid, why in the world would you train them to do that? Well, it's easier. That's one thing. And when they're sitting there, there's nothing disruptive about the rough and tumble play, and that can be quite, play can be quite disruptive. So anyways, most of these kids are reasonably well socialized by the time they're the age of 4, using one mechanism or another. They learn how to regulate their aggression, and they learn how to engage in fictional play structures with other kids. They learn how to cooperate and compete. And the advantage to having a well-socialized disagreeable person is that they really don't let much get in their way. So if you can get a kid who's disagreeable socialized, that person can be quite the creature, because they're very forward-moving in their nature and very difficult to stop. But if you don't get them successfully domesticated, tamed, roughly speaking, by the time they're 4, their peers reject them. And that's a big problem, because your job as a parent is to make your child socially desirable by the age of 4. Like you want to burn that into your brain, because people don't know that. That's your job. And here's why. It's easy if you think about it carefully. So you imagine you've got a 3-year-old child, so sort of halfway through that initial period of socialization, and you take that child out in public. Okay, what do you want for the child? Who cares about you? What do you want from for the child? You want the child to be able to interact with other children and adults, so that the children are welcoming and smile and want to play with him or her, and so the adults are happy to see the child and treat him or her properly. And if your child's a horrible little monster because you're afraid of disciplining them, or you don't know how to do that properly, then what they're going to do is they're going to experience nothing but rejection from other children and false smiles from other parents and adults. And so then you're throwing the child out there into a world where every single face that they see is either hostile or lying. And that's not something that's going to be particularly conducive to the mental health or the well-being of your child. If your child can learn a couple simple rules of behavior, like don't interrupt adults when they're talking too much, and pay attention, and try not to hit the other kids over the head with the truck any more than is absolutely necessary, and share and play properly, then when they meet other kids, the kids are going to try out a few little play routines on them, and that's going to go well, and then they're going to go off and socialize each other for the rest of their lives. because that's what happens, is that from 4 years old onwards, the primary socialization with children takes place among other children. And so if the kids don't get in on that early, they don't move into that developmental spiral upwards and they're left behind. And you can imagine how terrible that is, because a 4-year-old will not play with another 4-year-old who's 2. But a 5-year-old certainly will not play with a 5-year-old who's 2, right? Because the gap is just starting to get unbelievably large. And so the kids start out behind, and then the peers leave them behind, and then those kids are alienated and outside the peer group for the rest of their life. Those are the ones that grow up to be long-term antisocial, right? They're already aggressive. It doesn't dip down. Now, what happens to normal boys, roughly speaking? Imagine the aggressive 2-year-old types. They get socialized, so their level of aggression goes down, and then they hit puberty and testosterone kicks in, and bang, levels of aggression go back up. And so that's why males are criminals between the ages roughly of 16 and about 25. So, and it matches the creativity curve, by the way. It's so cool. If you look at the spike of creativity among men, 16 to 25, and it starts to go down, criminality matches that absolutely perfectly. So that's quite cool. So, and so the testosterone levels raise the average level of aggression among men. It's more dominance than aggression, actually, and testosterone is by no means all bad. And then it starts to decrease at about age 25 or 26, which is usually when men stop staying up late at night, stop drinking as much, develop a full-time career, and take on the burdens and responsibilities and opportunities that are associated with a long-term partner and family. And so, well, so that's the development of what I would call predatory aggression, because I also think that the agreeableness distribution is probably something like predatory aggression versus maternal sympathy. It's something like that. So if you look at other mammals that are predators, because we're predators as well as prey animals, if you look at other animals like bears, the male bear has absolutely nothing to do with the raising of the infants. In fact, the female bears will keep the male the hell away, because he's likely to kill the infants and maybe even to eat them. So there's no maternality at all in solitary male mammalian predators. Now, it depends on how social they are, but roughly speaking, that's the situation. Whereas with human beings, males are quite maternal. So, but anyways, I think the extreme of agreeableness on the low end, so disagreeableness, is predation. And the extreme on the upper end is maternal caring. And so, and those two things compete, right? Obviously, it's very difficult to be both of those at the same time. And so men, of course, in the wild, so to speak, are very, very few women hunt in modern societies or in archaic societies. And you can also understand why that is, because hunting actually requires hurting something, killing it. And it's usually something that's not very impressed about being hurt or killed, and that will emit a lot of distress while it's happening. And so for anybody who's compassionate, who's got compassion as one of the fundamental elements of their temperament, that's something they're just not going to be able to tolerate at all. So there's, in the evolutionary landscape, because that's really what we're talking about, there's tension behind the development of different modes of being in the world. And if you're good at one thing, that sometimes means that you can't be good at the other thing at the same time. So I was going to have a guest speaker for you last week, but the person I had invited in had some familial trouble, so that didn't work out. But she's a graduate student of mine, and one of the things that we've been working on in my lab, generally speaking, is the delineation of the relationship between personality traits and political belief. And so I've told you a little bit about the things that distinguish liberals from conservatives, right? The conservatives are high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and low in trait openness. And so that means a conservative is someone who puts things in boxes, puts the boxes in order, and doesn't like them to be messed up, right? So they like the borders between things to remain determinate and what would you say? And inviolable. And I think that's true at every level, from the conceptual all the way up to the political. I think the fundamental political question, and I think this is why the temperaments align across these political dimensions, is whether the borders between things should be open or closed. You see this reflected worldwide right now in the arguments about immigration, right? Because the liberal types are saying, open the gates, and the conservatives are saying, wait, you don't know what you're inviting in. And you might say, well, who's right? And the answer is, you don't know. That's the thing. Because sometimes the right answer is open the gates. These are interesting people. We could trade with them. We could learn from each other. And sometimes the answer is don't bother. What's going to come in is going to wipe you out and kill you. And really do it. I mean, so here's an example. This is why I think orderliness is associated with disgust sensitivity. And it's one of the determining factors of conservative political belief. What happened when the Europeans came to North America? What happened when the Spaniards came to North America? 95% of the Native Americans died. Why? Because the Spaniards brought illness. Smallpox, measles, chickenpox, all these things that the Native Americans had absolutely no resistance to. There were hardly any diseases at all in North and South America. The Spaniards showed up. Within 50 to 100 years, 19 out of 20 of the Native Americans were dead. You never know what people are bringing with them. And so what that means is that how should you respond to people who are outside of your circle of familiarity? Well, the answer is, 1, they might kill you in all sorts of ways. 2, they might bring with them things to trade that are of inestimable value. So you're stuck. It's like, how the hell are you going to reconcile that problem? And the answer is, well, we reconcile it temperamentally, roughly speaking. So half the people are temperamentally wired up to say, no, 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 let's keep the damn boxes closed. It took a long time to pack everything in there and to get it into order. And the liberals say, well, wait a minute, you don't know if you've got things in the right boxes to begin with. The things that you're keeping in there are getting stale and old, and maybe we need some new ideas and new people to rejuvenate the situation. It's like, that's political discussion. And the political discussion has to proceed because there's no way of solving that problem except by discussing it. So, well, how does that relate to agreeableness? We also looked at political correctness. And so here's an interesting thing. Purely from a scientific perspective, you might ask yourself, if you talk about political correctness, one of the things that the people who tend to be labeled as politically correct say is there's no such thing as political correctness. It's just a pejorative label that people who are opposed to those views impose on a set of beliefs to demonize it. Perfectly reasonable objection. And you never know, it might be true. But the thing is, psychometrically, you can solve that problem, and you solve it the same way that you solve the problem of what constitutes human personality. So this is the way we tried to solve it. You can think about it methodologically, because that's how you should think about it. The first thing we did was collect a very large number of statements from press accounts that seem to indicate what people generally refer to as political correctness. So we had a small team of people combing media reports to come out with opinions or attitudes that looked like they were characteristic of the differentiation between politically correct people and people who aren't politically correct. So we got about 400 statements like that. And what you want to do is, you imagine that there's a core set of beliefs and statements that people are defining in a particular way. And you're trying to get a handle on what that is, and even if it exists. What you do is oversample it. If you can find questions that might even tangentially be related to the phenomena in question, you include those, because the statistics will take care of the excess. Okay, so then what you do is you take your 400 items, roughly speaking, and you get people to register the degree to which they agree or disagree with them. Get 1,000 people to do that. And then you subject that to a factor analysis. And what the factor analysis does is tell you how those questions clump. Now, they might not clump. So for example, you could do a factor analysis of a set of questions, and you could find that there are 200 factors. Let's say at 400 items. There's 200 factors, and none of them, there's no big set of questions that are clumping together. And you say, well, there's no evidence here that there is a single underlying phenomena that unifies those questions that you could reasonably characterize with a name. Well, that isn't what we found. We found that there were 2 dimensions of political correctness. One of them looked like liberalism, except that the people who were politically correct, in addition to being liberal, were very high in trait agreeableness. And agreeableness has almost nothing to do with the classic liberal-conservative divide. It's weakly related in that conservatives are more compassionate than liberals. Sorry, liberals are more compassionate than conservatives. The difference isn't huge. And conservatives are more polite than liberals, and the difference isn't huge. So those are the 2 aspects of agreeableness. If you put them together, they cancel each other out, and so on average, conservatives and liberals don't differ in agreeableness. But political correctness did clump together into 2 categories. PC liberalism, we called it, and PC authoritarianism. The PC liberals were high in openness, high in verbal intelligence, and high in agreeableness. And the second group was PC authoritarians, and they were also high in agreeableness, but they were high in orderliness, and the correlation with that was negative in relationship to verbal intelligence. So we found that there were two categories of political correctness, that it does in fact exist, but that it's a very unstable construct, because factor one, which was PC liberalism, and factor two, which was PC authoritarianism, were only correlated at 0.1. And so what it indicates, and this is our prediction, roughly speaking, from the lab, is to the degree that there's unity, so to speak, on the politically correct left, it'll fragment into two groups. One will be the PC liberals, and the other will be the PC authoritarians, because although they're united by their tendency to agreeableness, they're not united by other temperamental traits, nor in their core beliefs. It's the PC authoritarian types, for example, who are very obsessed with language control. So, and it's funny that it's agreeableness. I've really been thinking about that, and and you know, again, this is a hypothesis in development, but I think what's happening is that, you know, your temperamental proclivity allows you to lay out a kind of radical simplification on the world. That's part of the advantage of having a temperament. So if you're a conscientious person, the world is a place to go out there and work. If you're an open person, the world is a place to go out there and discover new ideas and do artistic things. And if you're an agreeable person, the world's a place to go out there and establish intimate relationships. And so they're simplifying perspectives and simplifying personalities. They're the manner in which you're adapted to a particular niche. I think what you see in agreeableness in relationship to political belief is a proclivity for people to divide the world into defenseless infants and predatory oppressors, and that's blasted forward onto the political landscape, and things are conceptualized along that temperamental variable. So anyways, that's where we're at with regards to the analysis of political belief. Well, we've got 3 minutes left, and I'm wondering if anybody has a particularly intelligent question, or failing that, any question at all. Because I told you a lot of things that are, I would say, contentious, but I also think they're very much worth knowing. So, yes?
So you say that high in agreeableness has the simplified perspective of like that sort of a mother-infant.
Yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Yeah, yeah. Projected onto the world, period. Yeah.
So what would you say is the best way to go about, like, knowing that we have these simplified
yeah.
looking at the world, what then?
It's really useful to investigate the viewpoints of people who have opposing views to yours. Because they'll tell you things, not only will they tell you things you don't know, they'll also tell you how to see the world in ways that you don't see it. And they'll also have skills that you don't have, that you could develop. So for example, if you're an introverted person, it's very useful to watch an extroverted person, because the extroverted person has ways of being in the social world that aren't natural to you, that you can use to improve your toolkit. And if you're disagreeable, one of the best things to do with disagreeable people, especially if that's alienating them from other people, for example, because it can, you know, people treat you like you're a selfish, arrogant son of a bitch, and maybe that's because you are. It's like, okay, so what do you do about that? One of the most promising treatments, let's say, for that is get the person to do something for someone else once a day, just as a practice, and learn how to do it. Maybe you can wake the circuit up, you know, if you think that it's lying dormant in you, which is probably right. You know, I think we have a very wide range of propensities within us. Some are switched on, genetic propensities. Some are switched on, but I think that if you put yourself in the right situation or walk yourself through the right exercises, you can switch some of these other things on as well. But it takes work and dedication and discipline to do it.
Proactively confront the things which are not a part of our personality?
Yes. Yes. Well, I would say, generally speaking, if you want to adapt yourself properly to life, you should find a niche in the environment that corresponds with your temperament. Right? You shouldn't work at cross purposes to your temperament, because it's just too damn difficult. But having done that, then you should work on developing the skills and viewpoints that exist in the space opposite to your personality, because that's where you're fundamentally underdeveloped. And that way I think you can extend out your temperamental capability across a wider range. And to me, that's roughly equivalent as bringing a richer toolkit to each situation. You know, so if you're hyper extroverted, you should probably learn to shut up at parties now and then and listen, just to see what's going on, to see if you can manage it, you know. And if you're introverted, well, then you should learn how to speak in public and to learn how to go to parties without hiding in the corner and saying nothing to anyone. You know, and if you're agreeable, then you need to learn how to be disagreeable so people can't push you around. And if you're disagreeable, you need to learn how to be agreeable so that you're not an evil son of a bitch, you know. So, and the same thing applies even in the conscientious domain. It's like if you're too conscientious, you need to learn to relax and let go a little bit. And if you're unconscientious, it's time, like, get out the Google Calendar, man, and start scheduling your day, right? And beat yourself on the back of the head with a stick until you're disciplined enough so that you can actually stick to something for some length of time and not living in absolute squalor, which is something that would characterize someone who's very disorderly, for example, because they don't notice. It doesn't bother them, disorder. It's like, maybe they can see it, but it doesn't have any emotional valence, and so it doesn't have any motivational significance. You know, so the other thing you might want to think about too, if you're choosing a partner, is try not to choose someone who's too distant from you on the temperamental variables, because you're going to have a hard time bridging the gap. You know, it's hard for an introverted person and an extroverted person to coexist. And it's really hard for an orderly person and a disorderly person to coexist, because they will drive each other nuts. Why don't you pick up? Why are you so obsessed by it? That's the basic argument, you know. So it's useful to know about your temperament so that you can negotiate the space with your partner as well. And I don't think you should try to find someone who's exactly the same as you, because then you don't have the benefits of the alternative viewpoint. But you got to watch it, because you may hit irreconcilable differences of various sorts. And I've seen that most particularly among couples who are high and low in openness. That's a rough one. And also high and low in conscientiousness. That's another rough one, because they just cannot see how the other person sees the world at all. Okay, we'll see you on Tuesday.